Hi. So in this video, we're going to try and talk about the union budget. We'll decode the key terms that are used in the budget. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the terminologies and the details of the budget in terms of where does the government get its money from, where do they spend the money. We'll look at last year's budget and this will prepare you to understand next year's budget as well, right? If you think the content is useful, अगर आपको content अच्छा लगे तो please like कीजिएगा. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and do leave in the comment section if there are any suggestions or thoughts about what further topics we should use and create videos on, right? Coming back to the union budget, let's start with our discussion on that and understand how do we decode that. So when you and I make a budget, right, in general terms, जब हम budget बनाते हैं तो our idea is basically there is an income that is there, and from there we will basically sort of do our expenditures, and then whatever is left is the saving, correct? When the government makes the budget, they do not have the objective of saving money, right? I mean, eventually they will, but that's not their core objective. So the government actually works the other way around. They start with what is going to be my expenditure, and then they compare it with what is going to be the receipt or income. पैसा कहाँ से आ रहा है? And then they see, whether it is greater or lower, and how do you kind of work with that. So if receipts of the government are greater than the expenditure, then there's no problem. You're making more money. Now, usually the government doesn't want to make more money. So what tends to happen is in that case, either the government will reduce the collections by cutting tax rates, or they will increase the expenditure. या तो tax rate कम कर देंगे या expenditure बढ़ा देंगे, so that equation sort of balances, right? Most of the times in the world around us, we actually see the other scenario where receipts are lower than the expenditure, right? अगर receipt expenditure से कम है, if expenditure is more than the receipt, then you have a condition called deficit, commonly known as fiscal deficit, right? So you have this term, you would have heard of this term called fiscal deficit, where the government is basically spending more than what they are receiving. And the only way you can fund a fiscal deficit is basically by borrowing money, right? So आपको loan लेना पड़ेगा. If your income or receipt is 100 and you're spending out 105, then that 5 has to be funded using some kind of a loan, right? That's the structure that we are looking at, right? So that's where we start from. Now let's decode what these receipts are. And I'm using the term receipts again and again because income is a part of it, right? एक part income है, उसके अलावा भी अलग तरह के receipts होते हैं government के पास. So let's decode receipts and expenditures separately now. When you look at receipts, they are classified in two terms, revenue receipts and capital receipts, right? अब revenue receipts क्या होता है? You can think of revenue receipts as recurring receipts. They will happen again and again every year, right? Whereas capital receipts, you can kind of think of them as a one-time receipt that is coming in, right? So capital would be, let's say, one time. Now, within revenue, you will have sort of tax and you will have non-tax revenue that comes, correct? In tax revenue, if you're looking at tax revenue, you have two further headers, which is direct tax and you have indirect tax. You all know about direct tax. Any tax that you're paying directly to the government is basically direct tax. So your corporate tax and your income tax comes under direct taxes. Indirect taxes is where you are paying taxes on some kind of a transaction and somebody else is collecting and then depositing on your behalf. Examples are GST or the excise duty that the government charges on fuel. All of that is a part of the indirect tax, right? So that's the tax revenue. ये तो हो गया tax revenue, जिसमें direct आ गया, indirect आ गया. Direct में corporate और income tax आ गया, indirect में GST और excise duty आ गया, right? Just a quick update here. Roughly अगर India का tax collection आप 100 रुपए मान लें, if you believe that India's tax collection is 100 rupees, approximately, I'm giving you a very broad approximate number, in the gross tax collection that the center does, about 55% happens on direct and about 45% happens on indirect. Now these could change, but that's where it is. And within this, income tax is slightly higher than corporate tax at this point of time, right? So within the direct tax segment, income tax is superseding or slightly higher than the corporate tax at this point of time, right? I'll give you the numbers and we'll talk about it as we go along. So this is about the tax revenue. Non-tax revenue क्या होता है? What kind of revenues could come under non-tax? So one part could be, all your dividends that all these PSU entities give. RBI ने dividend दिया, SBI ने dividend दिया, ONGC ने dividend दिया. All of these dividends that are being given by public sector undertakings comes under non-tax revenue or receipt for the government. Then you have all these fees and penalties that the government is charging. All of that also comes under the non-tax revenue essentially. So ये हो गया आपका tax and non-tax revenue receipts that we are talking about. These are recurring in nature, बार बार होंगे, हर साल होंगे, correct? if you broadly look at the gross tax collection of the government, right? In the gross tax collection, roughly about 1/3 is given to states. And jo baki bacha, the remaining 2/3 is what is remaining with the net to the central government basically, right? This is net to the central government that we are talking about. Overall gross tax collection. So we'll talk about what is the overall tax collection and look at the numbers as we go along, right? Then come the capital receipts, the one-time receipts that come. So one example of capital receipt is the disinvestment that the government does, right? When they sell a stake in LIC, for example, this is selling of a stake. That's a disinvestment that the government is doing. That's a capital receipt that is coming. Eventually, remember, expenditure is more than receipts. Expenditure is greater than receipts. So equation balance nahi hoga, the equation won't balance. You're spending 105, but you're receiving only 100. So you'll have to borrow so that they match each other. That borrowing also comes under capital receipts, right? There are some other minor headers which are too small, so we can probably ignore that, right? This is your receipt. ये हो गया receipts पूरा. अब आ जाते हैं expenditure पे. Let's go to the expenditure side of the equation. Expenditure, again, you will have the same headers of classification, revenue and capital expenditure. इसको अलग तरह से देखते हैं. Let's start with looking at capital expenditure first. So anything that adds an asset for the government or reduces a liability for the government is going to be classified under capital receipt, right? So government ने कुछ infrastructure spending किया, या for example, exact opposite of disinvestment. If they go and increase their stake in a public sector entity, that's going to come under capital receipt. So ideally, the capital receipt part is the infrastructure that the government is building or investment that the government is doing that is going to lead to further growth in the economy. That's what comes under capital expenditure, sorry. Everything else goes under revenue expenditure. So your interest payment on the loans or your subsidies or the pensions you are going to give, all kinds of schemes, everything else will fall under the revenue expenditure bracket. Needless to say, revenue expenditure is the larger component of the overall expenditure that the government of India does. Fair enough? That's the spectrum of things. We already know that expenditure is greater than receipts. So we have a scenario where we have what is called as fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit, we typically look at fiscal deficit as a percentage of our GDP. When we look at fiscal deficit, we are trying to look at fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP to get a correct picture about, how much is the government spending extra or how much is the government borrowing extra. Obviously, there are layers to this analysis. We'll look at a broad, simplistic understanding of what numbers we have at this point of time, correct? Where can you find budget documents? You can go to this website called indiabudget.gov.in, where all historical budget documents are available. You can get the data, you can get data in sort of PDF, Excel formats, and download and work on that as you go along, right? Let's look at the latest last year budget estimates that we have and how do we interpret that data. You do not need to remember this data. Some of this will automatically come to you over a period of time, but it's important to understand the interpretation of this data as you look at it, right? All the data is in INR lakh crore. 1 lakh crore is 1 trillion. So you can also say INR trillion, right? Now just be with me in terms of what we are doing, and then by the end of it, you will have a good handle on this. Go right at the bottom of this table. Look at the last row, last column data. That's your expected nominal GDP for FY25. This is in trillion, so 326 trillion INR. Divide this approximately by 83, 84 as the rupee dollar number, and you will get the USD approximately 3.9 trillion dollar of our GDP that we are aware of, that we keep hearing of, roughly about 4 trillion. That's what the number is. So ये आ गया GDP का number. This is the sort of denominator in your fiscal deficit to GDP. Let's go up. The top half of this table, as you see, is receipts. So all these are receipts on the top half, and that is segregated into revenue and capital receipts. Let's call them A and B, tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Tax revenue may you will see that it's net to the center. So 1/3 of the total tax collection has gone to states. The remaining 2/3 is what you will see here. And I'll look at the latest year data and then I'll explain you how things go along there. So this is A and B. You will see that this data says 26 lakh crore is the overall 2/3 of your gross tax collection that is going to the center. So overall should be about 38 to 39 lakh crore. उसमें से कुछ 12-13 लाख करोड़ 12-13 trillion is what goes to the states. The remaining 26 is what is budgeted by the central government that they are going to get this, right? Non-tax revenue, which is dividends, the government expects an increase in that to 5.4, partly because RBI is giving more dividends to the government, partly because PSUs are also showing healthy profits at this point of time. So A plus B put together will give me the revenue receipts, that is 31.4. You see this number here right at the top, that's 26 plus 5.4, that's 31.4 trillion or 31.4 lakh crore. ये तो हो गया आपका revenue receipts. अब आ जाते हैं capital receipts पे. So I said there's a recovery of loan, which is a small number. You can probably call that C. That's about 30,000 crore or 0.3 trillion that you see here, right? Last column mein for FY25 budget estimates, the year we are in right now. Then look at other receipts, which is disinvestment. Let's call that D, that is 0.5. So we'll add 4 numbers. Adding these 4 numbers will be A plus B plus C plus D. So you're adding 26, 5.4, 0.3, 0.5. If you add these, you'll probably reach a number of 32.2 trillion. 31.4 plus 0.3 plus 0.5. Correct? 32.2 trillion is your receipt. This is what the government is receiving. Now, bottom of the table, you see the expenditure. So let's call total expenditure as E. So if I subtract E from A plus B plus C plus D, E is, remember, 48.2 lakh crore. 48.2 lakh crore is E. So I subtract 48.2, you will get a number of minus 16. That's your deficit. That's given here. Third last row, fiscal deficit, you will see a number of 16 lakh crore. 16 lakh crore divided by 326 lakh crore, which is your GDP, fiscal deficit to GDP, is 4.9%. वो number नीचे आपको दिखेगा. That 4.9% is the budgeted figure for deficit as a percentage of GDP. This is what we are trying to bring down over the years, because obviously you can't run fiscal deficits endlessly. Because you have a shortfall of 16 lakh crore, this 16 lakh crore has to be borrowed. ये same amount borrow करेंगे हम. जब borrow कर लेंगे, when you borrow 16 lakh crore, 16 plus 32.2, which was the other receipt, makes total receipts as 48, total expenditure as 48. So that balances the equation. Understood? That's what we see in terms of the numbers. You may want to revisit it once, just understand. You don't need to remember these numbers, but just interpretation has to be understood, and trends in these numbers is what you want to kind of establish and look at, right? What do you mean by trends that you're looking at? यहाँ पे two of trends, दो trend बहुत interesting और important हैं. पहला trend आप देखेंगे tax revenue में. In fact, non-tax revenue is also interesting, but tax revenue you will see is basically growing by approximately 10% each year, and that's a fairly healthy trend, more than 10% actually in some of the years. So there is generally a good buoyancy in income and corporate tax collection. GST collection seems to be doing well. Of late, there has been some murmur about slowdown, but we'll see what data comes at the end of this year, and we get into the next budget. But basically, last few years, tax collections have been robust. The second interesting data point is your dividend collections have been good. So non-tax revenue has also kind of kept pace, that has done well, that has gone up. Correct? Disinvestment has been slow. We haven't had any big disinvestment, barring a few small offers for sale that come. LIC was also not a very large one. So basically that's been about 30 to 50,000 crore in each of these years. Can be used a lot more by the government, but so far they have not done that. The interesting data, the second or third major important point that you see is this capital expenditure data. Now, in a country like India, government, there are a lot of subsidies, the government spends on various segments, various schemes, all of that is there. Interest payment is a very large expenditure for Government of India. In fact, the largest single expenditure for Government of India is interest payments, right? And then you have other sort of schemes or segments that kind of come into the picture. Capital expenditure has always been a lower number. If you see a few years back, out of this 41 lakh crore in 2023, you had like 34.5 lakh crore as your revenue expenditure, and capital expenditure was about 7.4 approximately. If you look at out of the overall expenditure number, the number doesn't look a very flattering number as such, right? It looks like probably 15-17% of your overall expenditure is going towards capital expenditure. What has happened interestingly is this number has grown well. So India has been spending a lot on capital expenditure, and that's sort of grown very well at a CAGR of north of 30%. In fact, the year before this number used to be 5.9, and if I remember correctly, the year before that, that number used to be about 4.2 or 4.4, something around that. So 4.4 लाख करोड़ से 4.2 4.4 लाख करोड़ के आसपास वो नंबर था, मुझे क्लियरली याद नहीं है, बट वहाँ से ये नंबर 4 साल में 11 लाख करोड़ चला गया, 11 lakh crore. Very clearly what's happening is the buoyancy in the tax revenues is being used to kind of increase capital expenditure, right? As capital expenditure keeps growing, you see more infrastructure investments, you see more sort of push towards what's going on in terms of railways and road infrastructure and a bunch of other things that have been happening in the economy. This is a healthy trend. We hope that this continues in the future as well. Of course, we are going to see what comes in the budget in the coming years and how that plays out. Historically, the government has emphasized on the idea of trying to bring the fiscal deficit under control, because the more the fiscal deficit is, you will have to borrow more. When you borrow more, effectively you have to issue more bonds. ज़्यादा bond issue करेंगे तो automatically interest rates ऊपर जाएंगे, because why will you buy new bonds unless the government does not pay you more interest rates, right? So it's all linked in that sense that you can't endlessly keep borrowing more and more money. At some point you have to try and turn it into a fiscal surplus. But it's like a known fact in today's economies that most governments try to run fiscal deficits, or they run fiscal deficits. They don't necessarily try to, but they run fiscal deficits. But at some point of time, we will have to kind of control it. That's the idea. We'll probably bring it down to 4.5% by next year, and then slowly kind of control it as we go along. A lot of things will happen here. Tax compliance will probably improve. Dividend payouts will probably improve. You'll probably see disinvestment taking a big part in the forthcoming years in the budgets that we see. And capital expenditure might result in better infrastructure that results in more tax revenue collection, because corporates will be more efficient over a period of time. So we'll see how things go, but hopefully this gives you an overview of what all these numbers are, what are ththese terminologies that are commonly used in the budget documents. Take a look at it, probably revisit this video. Do share your comments about what you think is you would want us to cover next. And that's broadly it in this particular video. Till the next video, thank you, bye.